Support for WBFO and What's Next comes from our members and from Health Foundation for Western and Central New York, where racial and socioeconomic health equity are prioritized. Learn more about building healthier neighborhoods at hfwcny.org.
I'm Jay Moran.
I'm Bridget Jaipal Valenza.
I'm Thomas O'Neill White.
We need to get together and let our voices be heard.
This is What's Next, a dedicated hour to have important conversations about the issues facing the marginalized and underrepresented communities of Western New York and Southern Ontario.
If we're going to have some real healing, we've got to have space to tell some uncomfortable truth.
What's Next continues our mission to discuss race,
equity,
and the common concerns of Buffalo's East Side and beyond.
In the suburban area, everywhere, we must work and teach our children.
And good morning. Welcome to What's Next on WBFO. And in fact, we are going to be talking about education in the city of Buffalo, most specifically about school suspensions in the Buffalo Public School District. This is a topic that has been discussed on this program before by my previous colleague, Thomas O'Neill White, who's done an excellent job with this. Of course, Thomas has moved on from WBFO. But with that, though, I have an opportunity to talk about this today with two folks who have been with us before. Sam White is with the Western New York Law Center and their School Discipline Project. Sam, thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
And also Jessica Bauer-Walker, community health worker, and of course a familiar advocate on this topic. I'm going to start off with some statistics from the Buffalo School District that last year there were 5,584 short-term suspensions and 1,145 long-term suspensions. And if I'm not mistaken, the school district is telling us that is an improvement. However, I'm pretty sure that based on some of the research I've seen from you, Jessica, that there are issues inside those numbers that we need to discuss and to try to bring out here to open up this discussion. Mm-hmm. Give me some of your thoughts.
Yeah, so we have a Buffalo Suspension Coalition that has a group of individuals and organizations with different expertise, from law to public health to family and community engagement. We came together in December of 2022, and we put together our research and data based on our shared understanding and experience of the issue of suspensions in Buffalo Public Schools. We recently looked at the data after doing some additional work and really trying to partner with Buffalo Public Schools on some of the issues that we had raised. And so we put this data back out recently and looking at some of the numbers that are there. So like you said, according to Buffalo Public Schools, there's some slight decreases in the data that they're putting out. But we would like to dig a little bit deeper into those numbers, really understanding the numbers of days lost, because those are just actual suspensions. And a short-term suspension is 1 to 5 days. A long-term suspension is 6 days to 180 days. And so looking at things like number of days lost, really understanding how many children might also be suspended in school, where they're still in a school building but not getting their education in the same type of manner. Those numbers are not included at all in those numbers too. And then I'll let Sam speak to this a little bit more too, just in terms of this whole concept of what we call disproportionality, which means that even though the numbers have gone down slightly, there's really not a shift here, and sometimes an increase in terms of students who are Black, who are low income, who have disabilities, who don't speak English as a first language, being suspended at higher rates. So if we're making improvements in suspension, we don't want to increase a disparity and make sure that it's just students who are white or upper income or don't have a disability who are suspended less, but we're really tackling this from an equity perspective. And I'll let Sam speak a little bit more to this as well.
Yeah, so when we really dig in, and we've had the benefit of working with the New York Civil Liberties Union and their statisticians to do this. When we really dig into the numbers, we see that over 1,300 of the suspensions from last year in the 23-24 school year were for charges that shouldn't have even been subject to a suspension. So 20% of that 6,500 suspensions shouldn't have even happened. They should have been handled inside the school building. What Jessica was mentioning was we have an idea of how many days are missed for a short-term suspension. the school's being transparent on their data dashboard about those missed days. But when we look at the long-term suspensions, it's a black box. We don't know if the student is suspended for 6 days, 7, or 180. And so we really can't assess how much education is really truly being missed.
I thought you were going to dive into some other more specific numbers. Well, I'll continue with just this thought to start. One thing that you've stressed to me before we went on the air is though you want to hold the Buffalo Public School accountable to legal processes, and there is also a wish to work with the school district as well. Is the school district, in your opinion, by not being more transparent, are they only perhaps exacerbating this problem?
So we do want to collaborate with the district, and we are working to have conversation. Me over at the Law Center, along with other partners, have actually drafted a policy to implement some of the NYSED recommendations that the school district has not acted on over the last 2 years since they were issued in 2022. We continually are willing to represent families for free in these long-term suspension hearings, and that's part of the work that I do over at the Western New York Law Center, and Legal Aid Bureau Buffalo also does that work. We are resources to the community, but there seems to be a gap in actual implementation and in progress.
Go ahead, Jessica. I'm sorry.
Yeah, so I think what we have shared previously, and we continue to, is a set of recommendations, right? A holistic plan for prevention, diversion, and representation. So a piece of that, if students are not having their rights upheld, we need to deal with that immediately, right? Because students have a right to an education. They have a right, if they're excluded from school, to have an advocate, to receive a suspension letter with the charge contained. And so we've worked with our legal colleagues to make sure that piece needs to be tightened up immediately, because we cannot have students having their rights denied. So our legal colleagues have helped. UB Law Clinic has also been a resource with that as well.
Yep.
And so we've identified through our experience and through some of the research we've done in conversations with the district, some gaps in terms of the rights in the due process. And again, it's helpful, and we would assume that the district, if there's some deficiencies there, that they would like to shore them up. And so they have made some progress in certain areas to deal with some of those issues. I think because this has been ongoing for such a long time, that does take change. And again, I would encourage the district to work with, for instance, the New York Civil Liberties Union, who are experts in ensuring that civil rights issues are upheld, as well as local colleagues, not in an adversarial way, but to say, you have a level of expertise, because that's not, they of course have attorneys and a legal department within the district, but we have community resources that can really help with remedying some of those situations, and we're going to have a better outcome if there is an advocate in the mix, whether that's a trained peer advocate or it's an attorney. So there's those due process issues. And then on the other side, once we shore that up, we really want to prevent this from happening in the first place, because I hear this district repeatedly saying we're a restorative district and we don't want to suspend students. Well, that's wonderful intention, right? And we see that there's been trainings and there's been more positive language, and we really very much appreciate that. Myself on the parent side really leaned into working with the district last year, being on a code of conduct subcommittee, being on a diversion team, bringing our expertise and our lived experience. I've had my daughter suspended. I've accompanied dozens of families in all different, principals conferences, restorative hearings, legal proceedings, right? So let's see how we can bring our shared experience, because my perspective is going to be different on the family side than a school building principal or a hearing officer in the district. Let's all come together, share experience and expertise, and put together a prevention and diversion plan so that we can prevent this from happening in the first place. That can be strategies as simple as building climate and culture in buildings and classrooms, like doing check-ins in the morning with students, right? And there's some very simple ways to do that. So if a student's having a bad day, you can deal with that proactively. Instead, some something triggers them off, they throw a chair across the room, they're suspended, right? So dealing with those underlying causes and recognizing we work in a school district in a city where there is a lot of needs. And I hear the district saying that repeatedly too, and saying we're working to address that. Well, let's address that holistically. One of our complementary campaigns has been working for better food and nutrition in Buffalo Public Schools, because we know that even us as adults, if we're hungry, we're not going to act our best, right? And so connecting these types of issues, having a whole school, whole community, whole child approach so that we can put a plan in place that includes health and wellness, that includes checking in with children on their mental, emotional, behavioral health needs. As Sam was talking about before too, making sure that students with disabilities, there's underlying issues. So some of their behaviors, there's usually a plan in place. So we have to work that plan to make sure there's positive behavior interventions. And then also looking to the New York State Education Department, who put out recommendations around the same time that we put out our initial white paper. And these are very much in line with what we've said as local advocates. And there was a Safe Schools Task Force that included a variety of people, again, including people who think differently, who see things differently. That's the type of approach that we need. And so things like, let's start with just eliminating suspension for pre-K through third graders. What is a 5-year-old doing that is going to warrant a suspension? Like this, we can fix this together, right? Let's plug some of these holes. Let's start somewhere with this. Let's limit these excessive lengths in suspensions. So again, these are things that it's not just our ideas, that up to the state education department, there's solutions, not suspension legislation. We have local and state and national advocates who are talking about best practices that can help us to really start to address this in a more aggressive way, given these high numbers, given the disproportionality, and for how long this has been occurring.
But while we do want state action, our Board of Education can enact these policy changes tomorrow if they wanted to. So we can't just sit by and say, it's okay that nothing's happening here locally because no action's been taken at a state level. Our Board of Education is empowered to change policies, and we really need them to do it. We really need them to stand up for the youngest children, pre-K through third grade. We need them to lead the state, not in suspensions like they have for the last 6 out of 7 years.
And just to stress that, we're talking also including the New York City School District, right?
Yeah, we're talking per capita.
So Buffalo has more than New York City.
New York City has actually worked to the point that local districts can take action. So New York City has done quite a bit of work to, again, have a shift. What would it look like to have a restorative conference instead of a suspension hearing? So they've done a lot of local work to address some of these issues because their numbers were much higher previously, but they have taken local action to address that.
And in the exploration of what type of policies we could put in place, we actually looked at places like New York City. What worked there? What could be applied here in Buffalo? We looked at similarly situated districts like Syracuse, who's also had significant progress over the last decade. Part of that came after intervention from the Attorney General. And as you know, Buffalo's currently under investigation by the Attorney General. So we looked at what worked in Syracuse and what might be able to work here, what pieces of their policies might be applicable here. And that's been put forward to them.
I want to get into restorative practices, but before we do that, I want to also just make sure that we understand we hear the term, the school to prison pipeline. Sometimes terms become cliches, and because of that, they lose maybe a little bit of their strength. How real is that? How much are we seeing? And both you from an attorney, Jessica, you as an advocate, is it real where we're seeing kids getting suspended in school, and that leads, whether anecdotally or statistically, that leads to, unfortunately, a life perhaps in prison?
Yeah, so I spent 4 years as a public defender in Buffalo City Court. And the majority of my clients didn't have the high school diploma or the GED. Right? They had been pushed out of the school system. And, it's kind of crazy because you see some of the same clients coming back over and over again. And while they may not be serving a life sentence, they are doing it a year at a time in county jail or 90 days at a time in county jail. And I actually shifted out of practicing criminal law to working on education and school suspension to try and impact this school to prison pipeline and to change children's trajectories in life, because there's so much that is possible for these children. And if we don't take it serious, if we don't advocate for them, and if our administrators at the school give up on them, we are shortchanging the next generation of leadership for our community, and we are shortchanging our community as a whole.
When it comes to a suspension, let's also talk about what takes place. There are hearings being held, correct? Both from a short-term and a long-term suspension. And in those hearings, the student and their families they have the right to representation, correct?
So it's a little, for a long-term suspension, there is a hearing. For a short-term suspension, you have the right to request an informal principal conference, but that's only available if you request it.
Okay.
So
which is a right that maybe not everybody understands.
Exactly. And I've definitely been involved in situations where I attempted to attend as an attorney where I was excluded. And inside of that informal principal conference, there is no right to an attorney there. I've even had advocates from my office at times, facing an attorney from the district on their side, but not allowing an attorney from our side to participate.
So we really try to let families know what their rights are. You are able to have an advocate. And we say all the time, whether that's a meeting related to your child's disability, or there's some kind of conflict in school, or there's an actual suspension that is happening, taking an advocate with you is really helpful, because these are intense situations. The family is going to see things from a different side oftentimes than a school administrator. And again, that's okay, right? But having an advocate is really important. And we know that when we're involved, we have much better results, because we're there to facilitate a positive outcome, especially those of us that are working in a more peer advocate type of role. So we have really worked to train a group of peer advocates, largely parents and youth, who are able to share that information, work to try to resolve some of these issues as proactively as possible. If they're on a situation with a long-term suspension where, yes, they are notified of their right to representation, but we find that most parents don't really understand what that looks like, where to go to get help. And that's not the default, whether it's a short-term suspension or a long-term. Even though you have a right to a principal's conference, oftentimes the principal will say that they did that because they had a conversation and informed that family that their child was suspended and they would be getting a letter. But we want to make sure that we have good process and protocol for that. So let's make sure that we actually understand what's happening, why it happened, what the next steps are, to make sure that if a student is excluded from school, why is that? What is the root cause of the behavior? How are they going to transition back in? So some of those process pieces are really critically important.
I know, Sam, you had a point there.
Yeah. So one of the rights at the informal principal conference is the right to question witnesses, right? So you can get to the truth of the matter, right? Maybe something that's been reported in the 2-sentence charge is not actually representative of what actually occurred. And that can only be teased out by follow-up questions.
And a lot of the short-term suspensions, too, are misunderstandings. So we see that this is one of the issues that we've raised as well, is many of these charges are subjective. And that brings in the issue of bias, which is why we see this disproportionality, right? Because there's misunderstanding. So disrespect, defiance of authority, insubordination, these are all very common charges. And for the short-term suspensions in particular that are excluding children from school, that could be very easily resolved in other ways by us sitting down and talking to each other.
Some of these suspensions aren't even punishable by a short-term or long-term suspension. In doing a analysis of the charges that children were suspended for last year, NICLU found that 20% of the suspensions were level 1 or level 2 offenses, which are not punishable by an out-of-school suspension. So that's more than 1,300 suspensions. And I did just want to circle back because part of the problem is families don't know where to get help. So I just wanted to say that we do have a Buffalo suspension hotline, and that phone number is 716-220-7081.
I most certainly can appreciate the right to have follow-up questions and review things for sure. We're talking with Sam White from the Western New York Law Center, Jessica Bauer-Walker, community health worker, and we're talking about school suspensions in Buffalo. We are limited to a certain extent with our time. I want to talk about restorative practices because I think in this case, as a parent, I can see kind of what you were saying before, Jessica, how you go into one of these hearings, and maybe you're just as mad at your kid for getting into a situation like that, and you're ready to accept whatever kind of punishment comes your child's way, and you're going to live with that though there might be long-term repercussions to it as well. So let's talk about restorative practices, how we can take this situation. There are going to be behavior issues in school. There were, even back in my day, yes, there were behavior issues in my school, and that's going to continue. How can we take it so we can keep kids in school and make a better, like you said, better results for everybody involved?
Mm-hmm. So my training and practice is as a community health worker. And so the role that I often play is being a bridge between families and community and the system, in this case, Buffalo Public Schools, and knowing how both of those operate, because it is a different set of values and ways of working, right? So Buffalo Public Schools and in most school districts, especially urban school districts, to manage behavior when there's an issue, have oftentimes had a punitive approach, right? And we can tease out the difference there between a punishment and taking accountability. And so for me, from a public health perspective, looking at violence or looking at behavior issues, we've approached this and taken this on as community health workers because we see children acting out is a mental, emotional, and behavioral health issue, especially because they're children, right? And a lot of the work I do right now is with teenagers. I live and work with teenagers. Wow. So it's a wild time. It's a messy time, especially right now, post-COVID. And we've had the Surgeon General say that youth mental health is at a public health epidemic level. So when we see children acting out, instead of saying, this is a problem and we're going to punish you for it, to say, what's happening here, right? So that's the shift from a punitive system to a restorative system, and our work around looking at this as a public health issue to address underlying root cause types of issues. So we've worked really closely with Erie County Restorative Justice Coalition, and this is kind of how we've always operated as community health workers, is to meet people where they're at, understand, why are you acting like this? What is the larger context of the environment? And we find oftentimes if we say what happened instead of like what's wrong with you, what's happening here, the whole goal of a restorative type of approach is to address what harm has happened, and oftentimes even unintentionally harm has been created, right? We certainly don't want children fighting or doing bad things to each other. We have to ask them why they're doing it first and foremost, right? Sometimes we need to remove them because it's an unsafe situation. So we're not saying this is actually not a soft approach at all. This is a very courageous way to act, because it's much easier just to pull a kid out of school and send them home and not deal with them. But to really lean into this with children and families and say, what happened here? And if it's safe to do so, to bring the parties together, the person who caused the harm, the person who experienced the harm, and folks around them that were impacted as well, and try to work through that conflict, right? So we're actually dealing with an issue instead of offloading it to another place that it's going to come back anyways, right? So from a public health perspective, we talk about moving upstream, dealing with the root causes of issues versus down the pipeline, we've got all these issues, right? You had asked about the school to prison pipeline before. Do we want to address some of these underlying causes? Because I could tell you story after story of us intervening in situations, or we specifically recruit for our youth community health worker program kids who've had issues. We're not looking for necessarily the student council leaders and the super high achieving kids. We're looking for children who have potential.
Could you tell me just an example? Because that's intriguing to hear. Just that you're finding kids who want to be part of this solution.
Yeah. So several of them, many of them, we've met through suspension advocacy. And I say this all the time about both parents and students. give me a person who is fighting for themselves versus someone who's just checked out completely, because I see a lot of that too, and that's worrisome. So I see right now with a lot of our children, those that are doing harm to themselves, who might have anxiety, depression, and, really just not well and turning on themselves. I see ones who are violent and acting out, and I see kids who are just checked out and numbed out. And we don't want any of our children to be in any of those spaces, right? So sometimes, the behavior is really inappropriate and violent. We certainly have to deal with that. And again, there's underlying causes of why that's happening. But a lot of this is just inappropriate behavior that needs to be addressed, and we have to coach the children through that. So a lot of the adolescents that we work with in particular, and also understanding just what an adolescent brain is like, right? Their prefrontal cortex is not developed. Like they're back in their amygdala. And so the way that they make decisions is not always rational, is very impulsive. And so instead of just wanting to make them be a way that they're not and treat them like adults or treat them like very little children, let's work with them to meet them where they're at as adolescents. And so you can see with a lot of these young people who are insubordinate, they have inherent leadership qualities. And so taking that energy, saying, you know what? I appreciate that you're speaking out for yourself or standing up for what you think is right, but you might want to try that in a little bit of a different way. So we try to pull those young people out. And we were doing actually a recruitment a couple summers ago at Massachusetts Avenue Park, and just talking to kids, because we do street outreach. We work on meeting students where they're at. When fights were happening at Fountain Plaza, we took a crew of parents and students out there, and we asked the students, we heard fights are going on down here. What's going on? What do adults assume about youth that isn't true? What are your top issues? And mental health was their top issue that they said, right? As well as food and transportation and school safety. And they told us really insightful things like, we got to talk to our students, right? Like we have to do things with them and not to them. And so that's really the approach that's needed. And so, we've had students who I could see were clearly going down a trajectory where they were going to drop out of school. They had some, interactions with the justice system, and we were able to pull them back, train them as a community health worker. We have a 4-day intensive training that we do every summer. And we screen those kids for, potential that they have, wanting to help, but having some lived experience in terms of having interactions with the school system or the justice system or child protective services, and making sure that they can channel those lived experiences to helping themselves and others. And that's a really powerful model. So we've seen so many of them going on, being successful, really turning around their academics in high school, going on to college and career. And we've seen some that have been deep in that we've really tried to help. And for, because they don't have supportive systems in place, they have re-entered that system, which is really heartbreaking to see. But we know the ingredients that work here.
And some of these kids that you've put together, they're amazing. I've seen them at the Western New York Education Equity Roundtable. There was a conference this past summer where these youth, they spoke from lived experience with credible voices to explain what it is that they've experienced and what they want to see changed so that their potential can be supported so that they can come into the community. And at the end of the day, they're telling us the same thing, that suspensions are really counterproductive and it fails to improve the school environment and it's stifling their success.
We're going to be hearing in the second part of this program from some of those students, as a matter of fact. This will conclude this portion of our conversation. It went too fast. There's a lot to talk about. I hope we can continue this conversation throughout the school year. Perhaps maybe we'll be getting some responses from the Buffalo School District. But Sam White and Jessica Bauer-Walker, thanks very much for being with us on What's Next.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Stay with us. There's more to come. This is What's Next on WBFO.
Did you know that WNED PBS is always working on great new local shows for you to watch? Documentaries like Kleinhand's Gift to Buffalo, which tells the story of Buffalo's music hall.
The hall is very intimate, and that intimacy makes everyone who comes in here feel a part of our family.
Fun and educational series like Compact Science.
Believe it or not, peppers are technically fruits.
And Shakespeare's greatest hits featuring some of his best-known soliloquies and monologues.
We are such stuff as dreams are made of.
You can watch them all on our website at wned.org/local shows. While you're there, check out the show pages and mini websites for additional content such as bonus features, photo galleries, and lesson plans. Find it all at wned.org/local shows.
Our mission at Buffalo Toronto Public Media is to serve our local community. And on WBFO, we do that by keeping you informed and connected to your community, whether it's by hearing from a local Black poet about what it was like to move from the inner city to the suburbs on What's Next.
So that emotional change with that culture change combined let me realize that basketball and being physical wasn't enough. I needed a way to figure out my emotions. So the first poem I wrote in the cafeteria of Sweet Home Middle School was Outcast.
Or it's exploring the East Side Garden Walk.
It's wonderful that we're seeing engagement in beautification and sharing gardens, because we believe that we can build more vibrant communities by sharing our gardens, by sharing our stories, and by building real connections between people. We came through as neighbors and cleaned this space out and began plot by plot putting plants in.
This is public media.
Hey, educators, you've been asking for it and it's here. Reading Rainbow Stories is ready to help your students stay on track. Each story is paired with activities to help students strengthen cross-curricular skills such as math and business in Lemonade for Sale.
Let's keep track of our sales.
Science and health in Germs Make Me Sick.
Usually, you feel better after a day or two.
Thanks.
But if you don't, you should see a doctor.
And history in Following the Drinking Gourd.
One of the worst things about slavery is that families were separated. Fathers, mothers, and children were oftentimes sold to different people.
Check out the new Reading Rainbow Stories collection on PBS Learning Media today to help your students stay on track.
You're listening to What's Next, our place to discuss the important issues of our communities of Western New York and Southern Ontario. We want to hear from you. Click on the Talk to Us option in the WBFO app, and we will work to get your questions or comments on the air. Do you have a story or concern that we should be addressing? Email us using whatsnext@wbfo.org. Together, we'll have the conversations that are needed. This is WBFO, your NPR station.
This is What's Next. So we're back and we're continuing the conversation around school suspensions. I'm joined right now by Rehma Kashindi, who is a youth community health worker. How you doing, Rehma?
I'm good. How are you?
Good. Happy to have you here. So for any of our listeners who may not know your voice or your work yet, what is youth community health worker? Like, what do you do?
So like my favorite like comparison or analogy is always like talking about a bridge between like the system and community. Oftentimes people are unsure of how to like address issues that they might have with, systematic things. So it's important for there to be someone who's familiar with the system and familiar with the community to connect the two.
And how did you get involved in this work?
Honestly, when I was really young, I had a friend whose mom was just really involved in, working with the schools. And in 2022, I think, she was just like, oh, we have a training coming up. And I was like, okay. And I did the training. And it was honestly like, before then, I didn't really know. But it was very interesting to see how multifaceted community health workers were and how much impact you could really have on a community. Even if you don't like make crazy changes, you still connect communities with other people and you yourself have personal connections.
Yeah. So what would you say to other youth who might hear this interview, who want to get involved or who care about systemic change but don't really know how to become a voice for change?
I mean, I think like the first thing would really just to be like connect with those around you, have those conversations and like find people who have like interest and like just talk about things that are bothering you, because really change is just the conversation that amplifies.
Beautiful. So we're continuing a conversation around school suspensions. I understand that as a youth community health worker, you've also been doing some work with this issue. So why? Like, what makes this issue in particular important to you?
Because I think in America, we have like a issue with like criminalizing young people, especially Black young people. So right now we've had so many like difficulties with like students getting in trouble for like minuscule behaviors, and then the proper processes that the people, like, you know, policymakers themselves have set aren't being followed. And it's just like a bunch of like blurred lines and a bunch of like disproportionate impacts that people don't realize. Like oftentimes when you get suspended, it isn't just, oh, you stay home for a little bit. You're missing out on schoolwork. You're missing out on the social connections that that you would have if you were in school. And then that creates some kind of anxiety because you're like kind of watching your back, making sure that you act right, or you might have an apathetic behavior or attitude that continues to exude.
Yeah, and after COVID, I mean, you were in school during COVID, so after that entire pandemic and students having to be separated from their peers, from their teachers, do you think that has heightened the issue when it comes to students having to stay home and not being able to socialize and interact with their classmates?
Yeah, definitely. And I think after like a pandemic, people are stressed. Everyone's going through it and trying to like, mitigate relationships, like everyone's having, I don't know how to explain, like everyone's having difficulty already establishing relationships, and like kicking students out of school isn't going to help with that, and isn't going to help with like getting back to a normal if we aren't really trying.
Yeah. And what kind of like long-term effects do you see happening with students, or potential long-term effects do you see happening for students who are being suspended and removed from the learning environment?
I mean, I guess this is where I can point to the infamous school to prison pipeline. I think that oftentimes when you're like not doing as well in school, or just like not in the school setting to be learning, I guess, you resort to other ways to connect with people. You resort to other ways to kind of fulfill the needs that are missing from school. So like those other ways could be, doing illegal things that end up getting you in trouble, or not knowing how to like make mistakes and grow from those mistakes, or just like not being able to function in a day-to-day basis because every time you've made a mistake, every time you've done something wrong, you were pushed away. So now you don't really know how to like grow in a healthy way, really.
Yeah. And as a student who's in school but also doing this kind of work, how long have you been working on this issue in particular?
I mean, it's weird because I haven't really been a community health worker for the whole time I've been working on this issue. I was really young when I was like having these conversations in the school wellness team in middle school. So it's like for quite a while.
Yeah, so you've been doing the work for a while.
Yeah.
So as someone who's been what we call a front line, right, doing the work, what barriers have you seen as a student, or have you faced when it comes to trying to create a system of change in a school while being a student that's not punitive in, like you said earlier, a society that is heavily punitive?
I think, for me personally, I think the biggest frustration that I've come into contact with is like policymakers or people who are like in charge being like, oh, well, we already have that in place. So they don't see it as an issue. So it continues to be an issue. Like it'll be like, oh, like we think we should have more restorative practices in school. Well, we're partners with, and it's like, yes, you are. But is this actually occurring in schools? Are there students who are, are you where are the benefits? Like where are the what I'm saying? What's the aftermath? Where are the numbers to speak to what you're trying to say? Like there's been very few accounts where we've seen like the fruits of what's described as such, they're trying so hard, but it's like this isn't really happening. A lot of policymakers often too are very disconnected from the school system, and it's like you can walk into a school and you would have a completely different experience than what is described at a board level, which is very disappointing, to be honest.
Yeah. And for a lot of people, like me, for example, I don't have a child. I graduated from high school in 2010. I am myself pretty disconnected from what happens inside of school buildings. So what advice or words would you offer to someone like me who's like, I don't have a student who's being affected by this issue. I'm not in school myself, but I want to understand, and I want to know what I can do. What would you say to someone like me?
I think it would just be having the conversations and seeking out connections with young people in your community. That's really all that I think, like, not to say that it's very simple just to find a kid and talk to them, but I think like putting yourself in spaces and putting yourself in the position to be a listening ear to a student is always helpful. I've had plenty of conversations with students who are, like, technically not the most polished, but they just know and they can identify that I just need someone to listen to me. I just need someone to hear me and someone to be available and readily like talking to me and asking about my experiences. Even if you're not in like the position to like change their circumstances, you can still do so much by helping. And then to think about it on a grander scale, these are the upcoming adults, like, so it's like, a lot of people are like, oh, well, I'm not affected. I don't know anything about it. I don't have a student. But you're going to have to live with them. You're going to have to work with them. You're going to have to, you know what I'm saying? Like, we're becoming adults and this is a scary world. So the more we can the more we're able to connect, the more like functioning of a society we can have.
Yeah. And going back to the frustrations you mentioned a little while ago when it comes to especially getting people to see that there is an issue in the first place. How do you overcome those frustrations? How do you work through them?
By asking those weird questions, I guess. I think my favorite form of like kind of like a rebuttal would be asking an effective question, because oftentimes like you'll have like a issue proposed to you or like a solution kind of proposed. Like you'll be like, okay, well, this is my issue. And then they'll combat you within like, and you'll ask that question that kind of like asks for like, well, where's the results? Like, let me see what you're saying in action. So I think that's like one of my favorite things to do is to ask those questions. And oftentimes there isn't like a solidified answer. And then when we seek out the solidified answers that's where we can really create change.
Do you think that policymakers and people who are actually in a position to affect some of the changes that you think are necessary, do you think if they actually had a larger presence in the schools that they'd be able to see your perspective better? Like if they actually spent time walking the halls and talking to the students themselves?
I definitely think so. I think it's difficult because of the workload, and I genuinely understand, but it's something that I feel like could really be helpful to have just conversations, and not even as like, a superintendent or a board member. You know what I'm saying? You can just have that conversation as a human being. Like, I feel like a lot of people forget that like we're all like human. Like, I don't know how.
Humanity of it
That's
all.
what I'm saying. And it's like oftentimes like we can just have a conversation. We can talk about the sky. I don't know. We can talk about the weather, and we can genuinely, create more of an understanding. And it was never like the policymakers or people don't care. I just feel like they lack kind of perspective, which influences the decisions that they make, unfortunately.
Yeah. So I know you've been working in tandem with the Buffalo Suspension Coalition. And some of the things that they've called on is a more supportive environment, less punitive, more restorative. Offer students supports when they exhibit certain behaviors as opposed to punishing them for exhibiting those behaviors. So from your experience as a student who's interacting with these students on a daily basis, what does support even look like?
I would definitely say I think what I prefer is a more proactive approach, and like that relationship building piece is really important to me, specifically because I just don't think you can listen to someone, or you can take advice from someone, or you can take counsel from someone who isn't like who you don't know. Like if someone other than my mom was telling me what my mom be telling me, I would get very frustrated. Like I don't know you. Yeah. So I think like as like a, like a beforehand, it's very important to establish those relationships to create like, what I'm saying, like a supportive environment.
Yeah. Sometimes I get to go into schools and do like poetry workshops and things like that. And I love playing these icebreakers with students. And sometimes I'll ask the teachers, like, do you want to leave the room so that they can feel, the freedom to be a little bit more candid? Sometimes I ask the teachers to stay so that they can actually see how their students really feel. And one question I ask often is, do you feel like there is someone in this building right now who you can talk to when you have a problem? And I always get mixed results. There's always a few students who are like, yeah, I have teachers who I can walk into their classroom and say, I didn't eat breakfast this morning because we don't have any food in our house. and I can't focus because I'm hungry. But then I also see so many students who are like, I don't even know where to start when it comes to finding someone I can talk to. So I'm going to ask you this question. Do you think that it's the responsibility of the school to start to harness those relationships with the students?
To some capacity.
Yeah.
Because at the end of the day, like, you know, the world, like everyone's different. The world just in general, that's like what we're based off of. Humans are different. That's an understood fact. The only thing I feel like would be like a helper kind of, is that what you're asking? Like,
yeah.
I think having like people and like staff and administration that look like the students in the communities that they're serving, which is kind of loaded, but I feel like it's also kind of simple. Like, it's very important for students to have people who look like them to, you know, kind of make it easier for them to harness those relationships. Because even culturally, like, you're able to connect with someone who you think has similar experiences to you.
Right.
So I think, like, to some capacity, it's like, you know, the district's responsibility to, you know, and also just making the time, making the space. Because I think at my old school, in middle school, at first we didn't have like things like wellness rooms or, you know, like people who were free to talk. And once those kind of infrastructure were set in place, I definitely felt more inclined to have these conversations or just to go to an adult or to have a trusted adult.
Yeah. And what even is a wellness room? Back in my day, like, that wasn't a thing. So what is a wellness room? Who's in these rooms? Are they counselors? Like,
I mean, I think a wellness room could look like anything, really, honestly. Like, I think it would be great if, you know, administrators would let students design wellness rooms, but I digress. I think it's just like a safe, calm, neutral space that's like allows for like quiet time and more, you know, like relationships like to be had with the people who are set there for a conversation. So like, if that is a counselor, if that is a social worker, whoever that might be, to have that kind of room where you can, like, if you're just having kind of you're annoyed, you can like walk into that room. You know what I'm saying? It's like it could really look like anything.
Yeah. So just space.
Yeah.
A space
that encourages wellness. I don't know.
Okay. All schools have these, or no?
Can I jump in from a
this
perspective?
is Jessica, everybody. Jessica in the building.
I just want to lift up what Rehma does and our youth community health workers who are so amazing, just chiming in on what I think adults need to do to be more supportive with youth, because it really resonates with me. I really appreciate you asking the students those questions, because that's what I always coach students on. Like, you have to find one adult you can trust in this building. It doesn't have to be everybody. And so many of the youth that we work with say they don't have a single person. And some of them don't have that in their lives either. And so that's what we're really trying to do. And we have an intergenerational program. So we have parent community health workers and student community health workers. So even if it's not your own parent, you know, I'm the mom that she was talking about before. We're in community together, right? My daughter and her are in school together, so she's seeing me show up, right? And other parents show up. So even if it's not your own parent, there's a parent that's there, right? And having similar shared experience to know what's actually going on in the schools. So we try to work with our schools as much as possible and find supportive adults and talk with our students about what they need. So that concept of having a school wellness team, we worked hard at the school she was at previously to put a team together that had students was the largest stakeholder group there. And the students eventually started to lead the group, right? Including Rehma was the team leader by the time she was an 8th grader, right? So the students are running the team.
Rehma.
But that takes work, right? That doesn't just happen by magic. So we specifically recruit students who have been suspended, who've had some issues. And a lot of times they have leadership skills, but they just need a little bit of coaching and steering them in the right direction. So you know, our program in particular is really looking to develop youth leadership. We're not a program or service-based organization or program. We're a leadership development. We're educating, we're organizing, and more we're having the youth lead. So we have in Buffalo Public Schools, there's parent groups that are recognized by the Board of Education, and then there's student council. But we have really worked with our organization to now have it be a parent and student community health worker association. So I'm the parent lead and Rehma is the student lead. So I don't do things related to students without consulting her and the other students. Right. And people say all the time, oh, your youth are great. Can they do this or can they do that? And I say, well, I have to go check with the students. Mm-hmm. And we don't do stuff, people will pitch ideas to us. And I always say, well, we're following the lead of our students here, right? And I think that's a big shift. Yeah. And I think that, this intergenerational dynamic, what youth are going through right now, is so different than even 5 years ago, let alone when I was growing up, right? So really to just create that space, like we meet with our students for 4 hours the second Saturday of every month in circle, feed them, and allow them to help co-create that space. And we do lots of other things with them. So it's the school environment. It's also creating those connections in families and neighborhoods and other places too, so that we have supportive, trusted adults that can really work with our youth and develop Rehma and some of these other students into the amazing young leaders that they are.
Yeah. And thank you for that work, because that's necessary and it's really powerful work. Rehma, your voice alone is very energizing to someone like me who's been doing change-based work for so long. So as someone who you're definitely an advocate, as someone who is advocating for the culture of our school system, what would you say to students or parents who find themselves in situations, maybe the parent gets a call that their child is suspended and their first thought is, okay, well, now I just have to figure out what to do with my child being home for 3 to 5 days. How would you encourage them to advocate for themselves and for their students?
Well, I think I can open by saying that unfortunately a lot of these processes are confusing and difficult to get through, but I will say always educating yourself and knowing your rights concerning anything that you might go through, punitive wise with schools. A lot of students, they have a kind of an apathetic behavior, oh, I just got suspended, I'm just going to go home. It is what it is. This is my reality. But it doesn't necessarily have to be. A lot of people don't even know that they can fight their suspensions and get it appealed. So it is extremely important for people to know their rights and to have kind of a relationship, or at least to know how to carry out these processes, and make sure that the processes is gone through properly. Because a lot of times students will just get sent home, or students will just be home or be suspended and they don't even know that they're suspended. And it's all of these things are happening and it's not fair to them. And so ensuring that they have someone to advocate for them or advocating for themselves.
Yeah. And we know that a lot of times parents are dealing with a lot of other challenges. And so sometimes the parent can't be there. Mm-hmm. But I would encourage parents to know what their rights are. And we do have advocates who are here to help. And those of us that have, my daughter was suspended too. So I know what that process is. I've sat through lots of suspension hearings. And sometimes a lot of these situations are misunderstandings or unmet needs with the students. And so for parents to have that orientation, for students to have language around that, to be able to advocate for themselves, because so much of the time, some of the reasons for suspension are things like disrespect, defiance of authority, insubordination. These are things that are, again, mostly misunderstandings that really shouldn't be a suspension. Right. But a lot of times parents will get that call and just, especially if it's 5 days or less, whatever, just stay home from school, right? Or students sometimes will look at it as a break and stay home too. So we need to make sure our kids are in school and they're being treated fairly, and that if there are misunderstandings, we resolve them. Even if there's, violent behavior, some of that stuff, most of that stuff is about unmet needs and underlying issue. Yeah. So for the students to have that language, to know that, and they've really developed a peer network, because they don't trust us as adults a lot of the time, and we don't understand what they're going through. Even someone like me that lives and works with teenagers, I'm very clear on that. Right. And so for them to talk to each other and have that peer network, but parents to also know you're not in this alone. There is help. We started a Buffalo suspension hotline, and that number is 716-220-7081. The students need to know they will need to have a parent or an adult sign off to be able to address this issue.
Yeah. Well, Jessica, Rehma, I really appreciate the chance to get to speak to both of you about this topic. Before we leave, I do want to know if you have any last words or calls to action that you would like to send out to our listeners, even different ways that they can get involved with any of the work that you're doing.
If you see an event that has Connect, on it, or if you see any community events that you'd be interested in going to, go out, like have those conversations, connect with the people around you. Beautiful.
And I think one of the things that we're working on with our students this month, even the ones that are in our program, we've had just over the past month, several of our own students who are trained in doing this work be suspended. Yeah. So just standing up for yourself and confronting this stuff, it makes a big difference. It makes a big difference for yourself. The more of us that confront issues that are happening that are directly impacting us, parents and students and community members, the more we can help change the system. So take care of yourself, take care of each other. You can call the suspension hotline if you need help, but make change in whatever small way you can.
Thank you. That school suspension, Buffalo suspension hotline number again is 716-220-7081. Thank you so much for listening. I'm Jillian Hanesworth, and this is What's Next.
Support for WBFO and What's Next comes from our members and from Health Foundation for Western and Central New York, where racial and socioeconomic health equity are prioritized. Learn more about building healthier neighborhoods at hfwcny.org.